Today we're going to talk about a new kid in town. On Monday, the Palo Alto Unified School District announced its pick for new superintendent to replace Max McGee. The new superintendent's name is Don Austin. He's currently superintendent in Palos Verdes, California. And Elena, I'm going to turn to you. What type of person is Don Austin?
So I've been working to find out more about Austin and his career this week, and I did interview him just by phone on Monday afternoon. So he's currently the superintendent, as you said, in the Palos Verdes School District, which is quite similar to Palo Alto in terms of size and demographics. Before that, this is his first superintendent job. His whole career has been in California. He was an administrator in Huntington Beach. He was a high school principal at 2 different schools, and started his career originally as a middle school teacher. And he really emphasized that he's a collaborative kind of manager and leader. He, interestingly, has been following Palo Alto for many years. He said primarily because of the mental health concerns and also innovative ways of addressing mental health concerns here for students, following the suicide cluster, which he followed when he was a high school principal. So it was pretty relevant to his experience, he said.
A lot of high achieving, high stress.
Yes, really similar also in that way in terms of culture in Palos Verdes that he described.
Yeah. So he's been a career educator. He got a degree initially in, was it physical education?
Yes.
His background?
And then now he later got a master's in, I think, educational services or something. And then he also has a teaching credential, of course, from the state.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So in terms of personality, what are some people saying about him, those who have already worked with him?
I haven't had the chance to talk to a huge number of people from Palos Verdes yet. I have a lot of emails and calls out, but one former parent did describe him as coming in as sort of a quote-unquote tough guy, like, someone who gets things done. This particular parent was involved in a anti-Common Core effort that really ramped up there right when Austin arrived. And so this parent described sort of the previous superintendent maybe not handling it super well and being wishy-washy, and Austin being brought in to sort of settle things down.
Okay, make it happen.
Right, yeah.
Great, so
I was just wondering this time around, what were some of the things they were looking for in candidates? Like, what was some of the criteria?
Palo Alto?
Yeah.
So the board had a whole list of questions, the interview questions and sort of things that they wanted to touch on. I think it was important to them to have even though they did a national search, to have a California person who's more familiar with the way school finance and just regulation works here. Obviously, all of the values around, being a visionary person educationally and being willing to innovate and sort of do new things here was part of the conversation. I think less so than when Max McGee arrived. I think that was very much what appealed to the board about him, and also what appealed to him about Palo Alto. It was, the heart of Silicon Valley and Stanford, and the prospect of what would come with working in a district like this. And I think also there's another set of board members and also people in community who really, this time around, wanted someone who would just be a good manager. There's been all these issues with compliance, whether it was Title IX or the budget. So someone who really just high attention to detail could sort of manage things, steer the boat, and less of the really high level, educational vision or being a visionary person.
So this year, this time around, they had an advisory committee from the community. That was a little bit different.
Yeah, they decided to add this group of people appointed by the board members who signed confidentiality agreements, and they met the 3 finalists for superintendent and interviewed them. And then they weren't going to give a recommendation or sort of a pick to the board, but just they came up with some sort of report saying, here are their strengths and weaknesses, and that was sort of input to the board's decision. So it was a way of sort of involving the public without obviously publicly disclosing who these people were who might have, they have current jobs and they didn't want to have their names out there.
Yeah, sure. So we should mention that he hasn't been approved by the board yet.
Right.
That's going to come up a week from Tuesday at the board meeting. We do have hot off the presses his contract right here. What are some of the provisions of this contract that maybe are different than McGee's or kind of unusual?
Yeah, so the district just released his draft contract this morning, which obviously is subject to board approval. It's a 3-year contract through 2021. His starting salary is $300,000, which is pretty similar to McGee's, which was $295,000 a few years ago. Different, though, from Max McGee, who got a $1 million interest-free housing loan, and then that was increased to $1.5 million to help him buy a home here. That's not in Austin's contract. He is instead being allowed to live in and has chosen to live in a district-owned property in Palo Alto, and he's going to pay a monthly rent of $1,800. So that's new and different. There was some sort of hoopla over the housing loan for McGee, which they increased by $500,000 because he said he couldn't buy a home here for only $1 million. So that's different.
He's right.
Yeah. He's getting the same.
And I should say that Austin said he's going to relocate here with his wife.
Yes.
So
yeah.
there's 2 of them that need to be housed. Yeah.
And he does have 3 kids, 2 are in college and 1 is graduating from high school. So yeah, just coming with his wife. The other thing that's absent from Austin's contract that was in McGee's was a provision that said that if board members had criticisms or concerns about his performance, it was all to be handled in closed session or through the evaluation process, so as to, quote, avoid damage to the board and superintendent's image and credibility. And that came up last year when 2 sitting board members called for McGee's removal, but they were really limited in what they could say publicly because of that contract clause. So that is no longer in here.
Interesting. Interesting. Now, when McGee came, I know that there was a whole entourage that went over to Illinois to a school that he was no longer at, but he had a huge influence on.
Yeah.
IMSA.
Yes.
And then
I also went to IMSA.
And you went to IMSA as well. And you spoke with a whole bunch of people who spoke rather glowingly about him. This time with Don Austin, we put up the article announcing it. There have been some critical comments from people who are in the Palos Verdes neighborhood or say that they are. So what are some of the concerns or what are some of the challenges that he's had there that might inform, what people can expect?
Yeah, so some of the major controversies, obviously there was this really strong opposition to Common Core when he arrived, and there's there are grassroots parent groups that form these Facebook pages that are still up and very active. The other major thing that you can read about in news coverage down there was this lawsuit that a group of parents and residents filed against the board for violating the Brown Act in their handling of this solar panel contract. And a court eventually found that there were 2 Brown Act violations. And so it's sort of unclear exactly what Austin's role in that was, but that was a big sort of to-do at the time, and a lot of upset over transparency and obviously adhering, the Brown Act. We've dealt with some issues here too. And
Yeah, we definitely have. So there may have been, he may have played a role, but it's unclear because it could have been the attorney for the district,
Sure.
it could have been the board
Yeah.
itself.
Yeah. And so it happened in closed session. So
To clarify that
hard
one,
to say.
yeah.
What's the other controversies? Union negotiations look to be very contentious during this school year, which isn't totally out of the ordinary. We've also seen that happen here, but it got to the point where teachers were refusing to write college recommendations for students, which seems pretty extreme. Yeah, and there was also there was a representative not from the local teachers union, but sort of the regional teachers union down there, who filed a complaint against Austin for some concerning behavior in a grievance meeting. And he denied sort of her characterization of that. And I reached out to her, and she's not responded to requests. So.
Yeah, so, and also in that case, I think he brought up the point, someone brought up the point that the grievance wasn't even filed immediately after,
Yes,
and
he
it
did
wasn't
say
by
that.
her either.
Yeah.
So raising maybe some questions about
Yeah.
what the motivation of that.
Yeah.
But didn't you say he had a rough start to begin with down there because they had 2 superintendents?
Yeah, and I haven't looked super closely at that because it wasn't really, didn't appear to be his fault.
That's-
Like when he was when he was hired in Palos Verdes in 2014, the board decided to keep the former superintendent on for I think the whole year, the new school year. And so we're paying two salaries at once, and you can imagine that people
Yeah.
were upset about that.
Yeah, yeah, because you brought up the point in your article that they're not a basic aid district. They're not
Yes.
getting the majority of their revenues from property taxes. So they
Right.
actually had about a half, about 50% of the budget that
Yeah, I
Palo
don't
Alto-
recall, but it was a much smaller budget, which is surprising because
Yeah.
Palos Verdes is also a really affluent area, but just because there's not a basic aid district.
Yeah.
So he described the budget as being, a wall that they came up against in almost every initiative that they would try to roll out in Palos Verdes.
Yeah, we think we have budget problems here.
Yeah, I know. Yeah, different kind.
Yeah.
What were some comments that we've been getting from your article online? I haven't gone through all of them.
Well, unsurprisingly, there's a whole lot of negative stuff on there. I don't recall it being this negative like when Max McGee was hired, but the Palos Verdes community does seem to be as engaged as Palo Alto, so maybe it's just a different kind of community responding. But there's certainly a lot of negativity and people just saying, they're glad to see him leave, basically. And I'm trying to dig into sort of what might be behind that and if that's legitimate or not by talking to people down there.
Yeah. Well, let's talk about some of the things that he's done while at Palos Verdes in terms of staff training. Kind of, you mentioned collaboration. I think you quoted him as saying he has a whiteboard like at the ready, so people can just talk, get their ideas down, and kind of work together. Staff training. I think one of the leadership. There's some sort of
Yeah, he sort of
leadership
formalized training and leadership opportunities so people within the district who are interested in moving up can do so, including classified staff or teachers who are interested in taking on leadership positions. If he implemented this monthly, more formalized training program for staff members, which was important to him.
Yeah. Yeah.
He emphasized a lot the mental health improvements there. They opened wellness centers at I think at least one high school shortly after Palo Alto did, and added more counseling support. He said sort of in line with what we were doing here, what this district was doing here.
Yeah.
So a lot of focus on student wellness and trying to balance that, the high academic achievement expectations world with wellness.
Yeah. Yeah. That seems fairly proactive. If they didn't have any clusters of suicides, I take it.
Yeah, and
They
he
did
said
not allow
that while they were sort of following what was already happening here, they became sort of a leader in Southern California because he said it wasn't happening in districts around them yet as much as it was here.
Well, it'll be interesting to see what the board does in working with him to see if no one wants to have difficulty from the get-go with a superintendent. So I imagine that in the vetting process, all of this came out.
Yeah.
And they're aware and ready to work with him. So I guess we'll have to wait till he's here to find out a little bit more about him and his plans. All right. Any last-minute thoughts or questions?
No.
Okay.
And so the board will vote May 22nd on his contract.
Okay. Well, thanks very much, Elena. That wraps it up for this week's edition of Behind the Headlines. Please subscribe to us or like us below, and follow all the news in Palo Alto on paloaltoonline.com. Also, we're on Facebook, Twitter, and Instagram. That's it for this week. We'll see you next week.